Good afternoon, good evening, good night, and good morning. I think that covers all the bases. Welcome to my October wrap up. October was not that good of a reading month for me. I started off with a really disappointing read, and of the 9 books I read, I only gave one of them 5 stars. I did have several solid 4-star reads, and I did read some really good short story collections and some pretty good manga too. So I will tell you all about them. Please stick around, or if you're interested in a specific title, all of them are in timestamps down below. I really thought that I was going to love Once There Were Wolves. It had all the right ingredients for me. There was an unreliable narrator. There was a setting of wolves in the forest, which, like, that sounds really lovely. There was a murder mystery. There were themes about recovering from domestic violence and trauma. There was a character with a troubled past, and this was sold as eco-fiction. I was like, yes, this is going to be one of my favorite books of the year, obviously. And then I ended up giving it 2 stars, and I was really sad about that. And the reason for that is that while all the ingredients were present, not to stretch this metaphor too far, but the meal was undercooked and oversalted, and the proportions were all wrong. The thing about this book is that it was really ambitious. It tells the story of Inti, who is a biologist, ecologist, something like that, who travels to Scotland with her twin sister as adults, and they go to rewild Scotland by bringing wolves back into Scotland. And that was really interesting and lovely. I didn't really know a lot about where wolves had disappeared from and rewilding wolves. And I feel like the book really gave very interesting explanations and perspectives about that. So for that alone, I am happy that I read the book because I learned more about that topic, and it came up in conversation a lot in the subsequent weeks. So it was one of these moments where I got to be like, I actually just read a book about that. Not to get too sidetracked. But I loved how ambitious this book was, and it was trying to be so many really good things. It was trying to be The Light Pirate, which was a book that I loved that I will be reviewing in a video coming soon. It tried to be The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. It tried to be The Sinner, the original book that season 1 of the Netflix show is based off of, and it tried to also be this cozy murder mystery, kind of like Broadchurch, sprinkled in with some Parable of the Sower. Just a lot of stuff that I really enjoyed. And the thing is that because the book was so short, none of the themes got adequately explored. So our main character, Inti, for example, has what Octavia Butler has already written about in The Parable of the Sower, a syndrome of hyper-empathy, that if she sees someone experiencing an emotion, she will experience it as well. So if she sees someone getting hurt in any way, or getting bashed in the head, or anything like that, she will feel it directly. And there was a scientific explanation for it in this book, and I didn't find it was that interesting of a literary device in the way that it was used. And it very directly paralleled what I'd already read in The Parable of the Sower, so I had high expectations. And her twin sister was recovering from a traumatic event, and a lot of the conversations that were had around the trauma and domestic violence and violence against women were all things that I'd already seen in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And we had this wonderful eco-fiction, but I've not written any eco-fiction, but I've read eco-fiction that's gone deeper and been more interesting. So just what frustrated me about this book is it reminded me of so many other pieces of media that I loved so much, but they were put in a blender and then it didn't work. And the book ended up having to resort to tropes and some convenient plot holes and some Deus Ex Machina, and just the characters weren't believable. Sometimes it felt like the author was really inserting herself and using a character as a mouthpiece for a specific point. And just the ending was predictable, frustrating, off theme. It's I really wish that the book had been simplified to not try and be this ambitious book that wants to talk about 5 different things at once in the span of 300 pages. I wrote in my review, I really wish that the themes of domestic violence and mental illness hadn't resorted to tired 80s tropes. And I wish there were more descriptions of forest and wolves. I saw this book and I really thought that I was going to get atmosphere, and just I didn't get a lot of atmosphere. Instead, I got, I don't know, it felt little hallmarky, a little. It really didn't sit well with me. And I'm really disappointed about that because I've been really looking forward to this author's other novel, Migrations. I have a hold for that at the library. Please let me know, does it fall into the same traps as Once There Were Wolves does? Because I don't think I'm emotionally ready to go through that level of disappointment again. Um, so I need to know if Migrations is a skip for me or not. I only really recommend this book if you like the sound of all these ingredients and you're okay to just suspend disbelief and not feel like any of these themes need to be explored too deeply or in too interesting of a way for you. If you're okay to just kind of have them be present and marinating together, you might enjoy this book. As I said in my Goodreads review, I'm not mad. I'm really just disappointed. I had very high hopes. So it was a 2-star read. I decided to drown my sorrows in an audiobook by David Sedaris, and I'd recently read Calypso, so I decided to finally pick up the book that I actually have, which I got at a thrift shop a very long time ago for $1, Let's Explore Diabetes with Owls, and then I never picked it up. It's pretty funny. It's not the best. I preferred Calypso over this book, but this is honestly pretty funny. So David Sedaris is a comedian who writes short comedy essays about his life, and they're clearly presented very theatrically and somewhat made up, but not always. He just dials up the volume on the hilarity and absurdism of certain events. So this was quite enjoyable. It wasn't like life-changing or astounding, but it was pretty funny. There's a great story about David going into a taxidermy store because he wants to get something for his husband, and the taxidermy guy is like, oh, you're really into taxidermy, let me show you the good stuff in the back. And they're looking at the good stuff in the back of a taxidermy shop, so you can imagine how bizarre that is. And David just comments things like, what is it about me that made this guy think that I would want to see the good stuff in the back of a taxidermy shop, and why am I not offended that he was right? And I was like, you know what, I would do the same thing. So he just touches on a lot of little life stuff. He talks about immigration, funny travel stories, some culture shocks, some politics, and it's just light and delightful. I don't actually even remember if there was an essay about diabetes. I remember owls being mentioned, but I don't even remember diabetes. With that said, it's like reading a stand-up comedy show, and it's not particularly memorable. I found his other collection, Calypso, far more memorable than this one, but it's fine. It's fun. It was a light 3-star read. It didn't fully pull me out of the disappointment of the previous book, but I had a nice time, and I would recommend it to you if you have an evening to kill. And I did listen to this on audiobook, and it was lovely because David reads it, and there's some excerpts from where he's reading live. And the audiobook has a little bit of music. That's absolutely lovely. But yeah, not life-changing, but pretty good. Pretty good. The next book that I finished was a novella and then a collection of short stories. The novella on its own would be a 5-star read, but with the collection, I ended up rounding it down. So the novella was I Am Legend. I snuck the DVD of this when I was a child, and my brother had borrowed the DVD, my brother, much older brother, and I snuck the DVD of the movie, and I had to stop watching it because of how scared I was of the weird, creepy zombies. So adult me, 15 years later, if not more, is okay, I'm gonna face my fears of the I Am Legend zombies. I'm gonna face my fears of what I remember of the Will Smith movie. Yeah, they're not zombies in the novella. They're actually vampires, and they're really cool vampires. Really cool. And what I didn't know about I Am Legend is that it was written in the 50s, and it's the prototype for what became Night of the Living Dead and all our kind of tropes of one member of the human race is still alive and everyone around him is a vampire or a zombie or some sort of undead creature coming to get him. And the book was so good. It was narrated by our lone survivor, Robert Neville. And he is truly alone. He is truly, truly alone. And he sees the people he loves turn into vampires, and they like stand outside his house at night and they're like, "Come out, Neville, come out." And he's like, "Nope, not gonna do that. Not gonna become a vampire." And he mourns the loss of his daughter and mourns the loss of his wife. Um, if you've seen the cover of I Am Legend, or if you've seen I Am Legend, you know there's a dog featured very prominently in the movie. In the book, it's like he's trying to befriend this dog, and it takes him a really long time to befriend the dog, and I won't tell you what happens next. Um, the novella does not have a happy ending, is kind of how I'm going to leave it, but it was incredible to read. It was so good. I listened to this one as well. I was in an audiobook phase, and I just couldn't stop listening to it. It was so gripping and such an interesting meditation on that, like, extreme loneliness of being the only human being for like years at a time, literal years, and the hopelessness of that, and trying to figure out if you're going insane or not. I really enjoyed that. The other stories that followed were pretty good, but not exceptional. I did like them, but I didn't love them, is what I'm trying to say. They reminded me a lot of sort of like classic sci-fi or horror. They were very much in the tone of like, think Ray Bradbury's The Veldt, for example, or a little bit like Shirley Jackson stories. In the same way that the novella deals with madness, the short stories also deal with madness a little bit, but otherwise there's a lot of familiar tropes. There's like a creepy murderous doll. There's a man who's really angry at his wife, and that ends up being his downfall. There's creepy little girls with telekinetic powers, and one of my favorite stories, there's a vampire who arranges his own funeral slash memorial, and it's really wholesome. That's a really wholesome story. None of these were particularly exceptional, especially because they followed the incredible novella that I Am Legend was. And just, I can't stop emphasizing how much you need to read I Am Legend. Especially if you're into any kind of like zombie uprising or like big vampire contagion and like the musings of the lone survivor. This is good. This is really good. There is a reason that this was the prototype. The novella itself, 5 stars. Absolutely incredible. You should read it. After a string of audiobooks, I finally finished a paperback. And as you can see, I had a lot to comment on in this paperback. So I read Prozac Nation, which is a memoir written by one of the first people to be put on Prozac therapeutically. She's a young woman who suffered from what was diagnosed as depression, and from her autobiography can seem like a couple of different depression-related disorders ever since she was young, like a young teenager, and then all the way through adulthood. So this is her memoir from before getting put on Prozac. I really thought that it would be more about the medicine, but the medicine really only comes at the end. This is more a memoir of her symptoms when she was a young teenager, an older teenager, and a young adult, navigating difficult family situations, troubled friendships, troubled romances, university, figuring out careers, figuring out who you want to be in the world, all the tough stuff. And the thing about reading this book, it took me forever to read because, quite frankly, it was insufferable. Because the experience of reading this book is just absolutely insufferable in the way that her depression is. I found it very painfully relatable, which is why it's so tabbed up like this. And yeah, just real painful. Painful is the word, painful and insufferable. I really respect her vulnerability, and I really respect how much she presented herself not as like a perfect victim or patient or anything like that. It's very clear that she is self-centered, partially as a result of her illness. She doesn't always manage it well. She doesn't always treat other people well. As the reader, you find yourself really frustrated with her. She's frustrated with herself. She does things that are not great and hurt the people around her. And it was so frustratingly relatable. And it was just that relatability. It really made me want to DNF the book. It really made me want to just put this down and not look at that aspect of depression where you and your own sadness becomes the center of every single day. and it becomes this sort of like very warped and twisted introspection. The guilt spiral that keeps on guilting, that keeps on making you do not great things, that keeps on guilting, and constantly trying to fix the problem, but only making it worse. This book documented that process really, really well, and again, that's why I could only take it in very small doses. That said, I'm really glad that I read it. It was actually incredibly worth reading. This book brought back a lot of memories that and things that I experienced as a teenager and as a younger adult. So this prompted just a lot of self-reflection for me and my own struggles with illness. And I'm really glad that I annotated it. It was really hard not to annotate and tab more than what you can see here. It was a lot. I also found that the epilogue and the afterword were really interesting because she talked both about the overprescription of psychiatric medication as well as how people with mental illness are underserved and not getting the help that they need. It was really interesting for her to contrast those two and talk about various causes and what that can lead to in society and sort of see it from her own perspective. It's really hard for me to talk about this book, honestly. It made me very emotional, as you can probably see. It's hard for me to form coherent sentences around it, but this was really good. If you've enjoyed other like depression literature, if you've read The Bell Jar or Girl Interrupted or Darkness Visible, and you want more of that, go for it. But if you're not ready to kind of deal with the self-centeredness that it can take to claw out of a depression, then I would recommend against this because it is very harrowing. It's a very difficult book to read, I have to say, but I absolutely loved it, and it was 4 stars. A very painful 4 stars. I'm really glad that I picked up Lonely Castle in the Mirror after that because I needed a little bit of a heartwarming, nothing much happens, but then I cry a little bit at the end story, and Lonely Castle in the Mirror really did that for me. It's a pretty slow story about a young girl who refuses to go to school anymore because she's being bullied, and she's terrified of going to school. And her parents just kind of go, okay, all right, stay home, bye. And during the day while her parents are gone, she sees that her mirror is glowing. And when she touches it, she steps inside a world that's run by a wolf. And she and 7 other children who also seem to not be going to school get to live in this castle. And they get to stay in it for, I think, exactly a year, or like a little under a year. And they get to stay in it unless one of them finds a key and uses it in the wishing room, and then their wish will be granted. So one of their wishes can be granted. But if that happens, then they will all forget the experience that they had together. So then I'd say for 3/4 of the book, the kids are just interacting with each other, and it's quite mundane and it's very slow. And I think that's why a lot of people don't like this book that much. And that is one of the reasons that it ended up getting a 3.5 rounded down to 3 stars from me. But it's still kind of sickly sweet, and the way the story develops and the way we watch the friendships form and find out more about the characters. By the end of the book, I was feeling multiple emotions at once and crying a little. So that said, the last quarter of the book or so, the pace picks up and the story gains some gravitas that I think the mundanity of the earlier sections is kind of necessary to sort of contrast the ending and have the ending come out in the way that it does. So the ending really takes us on a feels trip, if you will. And if you're looking for emotional children's literature that kind of feels like a very sickly sweet fairy tale and that will make you feel things, like multiple feelings at once, too many emotions to name, then I do recommend this. If you have enjoyed other kind of sentimental Japanese literature like Before the Coffee Gets Cold or Sweet Bean Paste, and you're interested in like the middle grade version of that, this is the book that I would recommend for you. As I'm looking back at what I read, I'm like, oh, I needed a lot of comfort this month. Okay, there's a lot there. The next book that I picked up and finished in one sitting, because it was a short little manga, was She and Her Cat. And this was a book that someone recommended to me a couple of weeks after Willow died. Willow, my cat, who died in February. And I was really sad, and I was looking for books to get me through it. And I was looking at books for the connection between a human and a cat. So someone recommended this. Thank you for that. This is the manga told from the perspective of a cat who a human finds. And then the cat sees the human's life, and you get to see how much the cat loves her. He was a cat, she was a girl. Can I make it any more obvious? This manga was so adorable, like so adorable, and just wholesome. There weren't any high stakes, there wasn't a lot of plot. It's really what it says on the tin. There's a cat, he loves the girl, we get to see her going through her domestic life, sometimes having difficult conversations on her cell phone, sometimes making dinner even though she's really tired after work, sometimes coming home late and the cat worrying. No plot, just vibes, lots of cuteness factor. I recommend this if you love your cats more than you ever thought possible and need to read about how much they love you back. Because they do love you back. Cats are absolutely amazing. 4 stars. So this is a book that I'm really nervous about talking about because it relates to some of my professional interests from when I was a researcher. And it's also quite charged. It's a sociological book about the divide in terms of class and race on people's diet, the effects of class and race on people's diet. It's called How the Other Half Eats, and it's by a sociologist who, for her PhD project, shadowed 4 families from different ethnic and economic backgrounds and took a look at what they're eating in their day-to-day life and what sort of food and nutrition choices they make and why. Specifically, she focused on families, and especially mothers who had children that were old enough to make some of their own nutritional decisions, so usually teenagers. In the world of nutrition research, there's been a lot of conversations around how do we get people to eat better. And some of the problems and limitations for why people eat badly tend to be very simplistic explanations, such as the explanation of food deserts and people not being educated about nutrition and lack of access to foods. I found that the author did a really excellent job of destroying some of those myths and showing why they're oversimplified and really humanizing some of the decisions that people make around food. One of the takeaways that I found the most striking was how she talked about the emotional saliency of saying yes to bad food, so junk food, treats, all these kinds of things, and how saying yes or no is emotionally very different for someone who can say yes to a lot of their child's other requests, such as for new clothes, new technology, camp, anything that requires financial security, versus someone who is unable to provide that child with other things. When you're economically very stable and you can say yes to your kid a lot, it's very easy to say no to a chocolate bar. But when that's one of the few things that you can buy for your child and they are begging you for that Kit Kat, it's very difficult to not just let them have this joy, because there's not a lot else that you can give them. The author talked a lot about the pressures that are put on mothers and for them to be good mothers, for them to feed their family well. All the mothers that the author interviewed were working mothers, whether they had a partner or not. And it was really fascinating to see that none of them felt like they were doing enough for their kids. This included the super well-off, economically well-off, very stable mother whose kids were basically little granola children, and she was like, no, you can't have an apple, that's too much sugar. That kind of vibe. She never thought that she was doing enough either. I found that really interesting commentary in terms of how we currently take care of mothers in North America, or lack thereof. As a scientist and a human, I've been thinking about nutrition for a very long time. I'm aware of things that don't work. I'm aware that diet culture doesn't work, shame doesn't work, restrictions doesn't particularly work. The way that I approach my own personal nutrition is from a perspective of abundance. I try to give my body everything it needs. So it's the opposite. For me, it's an opposite mind frame away from restriction. So it's not, oh, I'm having too much sugar. It's more, oh, I'm hungry, I'm going to eat food that's going to fuel me. And I try to really recontextualize things in that way. And that can be really hard. And it can be really hard to sometimes look back on a week and be like, oh, did I indulge in too much comfort food? Did I eat healthy enough? Did I give my body what it needed? And I feel like I'm always thinking about this because I know how important good nutrition is. And I imagine a lot of people are thinking about it now, especially when the onus on our health is put on us and the economy is tanking to such a degree that the prices of groceries have doubled in the past few years. I'm going off on a little tangent here, but what I absolutely loved about this book, and the reason it got 5 stars, was because there was no shaming in this book. It was simply observation and sociological observation and noting the fact that, like, we eat for a whole host of reasons. Yes, to fuel our bodies, but also to connect with our families, to connect with our roots, to comfort ourselves, to enjoy the food. And none of these things are like morally reprehensible, and that there's no such thing as a perfect nutrition. So all of these kinds of things were made like really clear in this book. I really enjoyed it. If you like accessible sociology, if you're interested in nutrition and really don't want to address it from this like purity righteousness angle of restriction, or this idea that there are certain correct ways in which you should be eating, or what makes a food good or bad, because it's not always its nutritional value, quote unquote. There's a cultural value to a lot of different foods. All of that is explored in this book. I highly recommend it. It's so hard to find. None of my libraries carried it. I ended up buying the audiobook. It is really hard to find, but I really hope you do, because it's incredible. And like I said, it's really hard to talk about because it's just got my brain buzzing with so many ideas. I feel like it's hopefully once the ideas percolate a little more, I'll be better versed in this topic, because I really feel like I learned a lot. And I'm very grateful for the author for publishing her PhD research in such an accessible way. It was really good. 5 stars. It was October after all, so I had to go back to being spooky, and I reached for Shirley Jackson. Why did no one tell me that Shirley Jackson had good stuff other than The Lottery, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and Hill House? Why didn't no one tell me that she's like a treasure trove of amazing short stories? Amazing ones? It's like really good. Okay, there were some short stories in this collection, Dark Tales, that like I listened to this on audiobook and I had to just pause it, the audiobook, and like go take a little walk. Go take a little walk to clear my head because it was so weird. She uses uncanniness as the creepy device in a couple of stories that I absolutely loved. And she uses a lot of this like uncertainty and not giving you full answers in order to increase the sense of dread. So some of the horror can be quite subtle, but subtle in a way that it's like a needle just like pokes you in exactly the right place. You can't necessarily tell what poked you, but you feel it. You feel how sharp it is, and it feels weird, and it feels ghostly and gross, and what's going on? And these are just amazing Gothic stories from the middle of the last century. People get trapped in a painting. There's a creepy ghost child, because what short story collection isn't complete without a creepy ghost child? There was evil elderly women who are spreading gossip on purpose. There's parents who don't recognize their own daughter. That was one of my favorite stories. There's a lot, and it's so good. And it's so good. I'm now thinking, should I upgrade this to 5 stars? I think the reason I gave it 4 stars, what was the reason? Okay, the reason I gave it 4 stars is because I wasn't completely smart enough for this collection. There were a few short stories that I had to go and then look up the meaning of to understand them, because they ended and I was like, I don't get it. What that showed me is that I need more exposure to Gothic fiction to like better understand the genre's like conventions and language and interpret the stories better, and that I'm probably going to need to reread this and read more Shirley Jackson. So all that said, if you like classic Gothic short stories, who doesn't? And if you jive well with the kind of horror that unsettles you and you don't necessarily know why, especially if you don't necessarily understand what the story is saying, but you're okay with that. If you're okay with the kind of horror also where you have unreliable narrators, you don't know who's real, what's real, I recommend this. It's a very interesting collection, and I cannot wait to read more Shirley Jackson. I'm so excited. And lastly, some Junji Ito. I started reading whatever Junji Ito I could find from my library last year, and I think this is like the 6th or 7th volume. It's not the best I've ever read. I've read better Junji Ito, but it was pretty good. It's about a pair of siblings who one of them has made a deal with the devil, and the other one likes to eat people's brains. And they team up and just sow terror around Japan. They don't seem to particularly like each other. I don't know if they would call it teaming up, but that's effectively the response. So the first story is the titular story in the collection, The Dissolving Classroom. Because the boy who's made a deal with the devil, every time he apologizes to someone, the devil grows stronger and it makes the person's brain melt. Is there a logic to this? Not really. Are the illustrations of brains melting pretty cool? Yeah, kind of. Kind of. I read about people's brains and faces melting, and I liked it. I liked it a lot. This was just a single session read that I read on the eve of Halloween, and I was like, yes, spooky season has arrived. We've done very good. I would not recommend this as your first Junji Ito, but if you've read a bunch and you happen to come across this, it's worth it. It's weird. It's like body horror, gross squishy stuff, which he does a lot in his other work. If you like the gross squishy stuff, body horror, gloopy bloopy eyeballs in a puddle of human flesh, if you're into that, this is the story. If all of that sounds terrible to you, walk away right now, because, like, fair enough. The drawings in this are really graphic, and the little child is extremely terrifying, and she will give you nightmares. So that's why this got 4 stars. I would say that October was a relatively unassuming reading month for me, but I still did read a couple of really good books. I also made allusions to some other books that I read in the months of July, August, and September. I have filmed wrap-ups for those, and they will be coming in the following weeks. I figured they don't need to be on time. Sometimes you guys are watching wrap-ups from 6 months ago, so why not? So you'll be getting wrap-ups over the next few weeks as I continue to try and revive this channel and try and revive myself. I hope you really enjoy it. My other little announcement is that I will be attempting to do NaNoWriMo this year. We'll see how that goes. It's the first time I'd be doing it in over a decade, and I will try to vlog the process a little bit. And thanks for sticking around. Thanks for watching the video. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day and read a really good book soon. Okay, bye.